All right, guys, thank you for listening. I'm here with permaculture designer, premier permaculture designer from the Arizona region, Zotero. Zotero, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really good. How you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for asking. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself to people a little bit? I know you're working in aquaponics, permaculture, community gardening, all sorts of things. So, can you
Yeah,
just go
so
on that real quick?
for sure. So I'm Zotero Citlalcoatl. I live in Tucson, Arizona. Um, Pretty much Arizona native. Was born in Arizona. My family has roots in the Northern Desert, pretty much. Since time immemorial. Um, and I've learned how to grow from both sides of my family, and uh, done the permaculture thing, done the water harvesting thing in Tucson in Arizona. And I'm part of the Sonoran Permaculture Guild. I teach workshops and um, just have a lot of experience. I've designed over 150 sites at this point,
That's
a lot of
fantastic.
projects, a lot of like community-based projects.
That's awesome, man. That's very cool. Neat, neat. All right. Let's. What you mentioned that you have some family heritage working in that particular region of the world. Did you always see yourself getting into that sort of like community gardening, the teaching workshops, or was it something that you kind of just stumbled across later on in life?
Well, it's kind of hard to say because like growing up, um, like I lived in Phoenix. It's like urban sprawl kind of thing. So, um, going from that to like, um, we would go to Mexico every summer. Because my grandfather lives on communal land, so you have to work it or you lose it kind of thing.
Okay.
So, uh, we our family has like 200 acres down there, so it's a lot of work. So it meant that we would travel over there in the summers. So they didn't they didn't have electricity or like running water until 1995. So
95.
it was like
Okay.
going from yeah 1995. So it was like going from like urban sprawl to like backwoods
Yeah.
Mexico. Like
Yeah.
like now we're on well water and we're composting our turds and like
Yeah. Yeah.
so it
Yeah.
was like not really like a choice. It was just kind of like this is the way we live our lives. And
Yeah. Absolutely.
like like that whole side of my family, they know how to grow. Like they know how to grow animals and plants, how to harvest animals and plants. So yeah, I would grow up, and if you wanted a chicken, you would go and get the chicken you wanted. The same thing with the cows, goats. A lot of my aunts know how to make like cheese and things like that.
Very cool.
Yeah, like my grandfather, he was the person you would go to if you wanted like peanuts and white corn seeds and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's like always that stuff going on.
Yeah, that's very, very cool. That's so different than like you were saying, like the urban sprawl environment where you're just like going to the
Yeah, so
convenience
like
store, stuff like that.
as a young person, it was like hard to kind of get into it.
Hmm.
Because you're like all pampered and whatever, and then it's like, damn, like I'm gonna have to spend my summer in like 100 plus heat with no AC.
Yeah,
and,
yeah,
and no running water,
yeah,
and all this stuff. Because it's different. Like you don't take showers every day. That's crazy talk. That's
yeah,
crazy talk.
yeah. It's like
You
unnecessary
yeah,
luxury almost. Yeah,
yeah, it's totally different. Totally different.
yeah,
Like milk is warm, not cold. So it was stuff like that.
yeah. That's very interesting. Okay, so yeah, you kind of lived in both worlds coming up early on, yeah?
Yeah, and I guess like as I grew up, I ended up kind of getting into it. So in high school, I really um, got into eating healthy, um, and obviously that leads you into growing and gardening and all this stuff, and that's obviously like a tradition in my family. So then you start connecting with people like local to you, right? They're doing the same thing,
Sure.
and it was really interesting because like in a lot of like a lot of the gardening stuff, like it was so different from like what I grew up seeing being done, right? And it just seemed super like wasteful,
Yeah.
like doing like raised beds and things like that. Um, because you know I grew up with like seeing people grow with no like standard irrigation and stuff like that. Um, in the desert, super successful, like on a pretty large scale, you know,
Yeah.
like feeding their whole family scale and setting some of that off
Oh wow.
to make ends. But like, you know, in especially in Phoenix, like um, a lot of the permaculture movement has got permaculture confused with food production, and food production is a part of permaculture, but it's not the whole thing. So I kind of started like for in the beginning in Phoenix, permaculture seemed like just another way of gardening, like another gardening method, right?
Sure.
Because a lot of the folks in Phoenix don't really get too deep, much deeper into it than just the growing aspect of it. So it wasn't until I came down to Tucson for college that I started connecting with some of the permaculture folks down here, and it was really interesting because it was like pretty much a lot of things that people are doing um, in traditional communities in Mexico and even here in the States and stuff. Because you can see you can go to like ancient ruins here all over Arizona and see how the people used to do agriculture in a way that worked in the desert. So it's just real interesting because it was like the same kind of things, but just a little bit more efficient. Like they were composting turds, but they were doing it in a way where it was like just cleaner, you know,
Yeah. Sure.
um, and more efficient and kind of tied into different things. Like it was what I really liked about it was how you can get a lot of stuff going on and happening um, just by thinking about how things are related to each other, how they are connected to each other, and trying to design stuff so that when you're doing one thing, you're doing several things at the same time. And in a lot of like traditional communities where maybe it is like subsistence farming and it's the same thing, you only have so much time. So you have to stack functions. So a lot of I feel like in Tucson, the permaculture movement is it understands the food production piece and the points of that and everything. There's more balance in terms of like bringing it all together and really thinking about um, what does a regenerative system look like in the desert? Because at the end of the day, that is what all permaculture is really about. It's about recreating natural systems so that those systems can regenerate themselves on their own without you. And sure, like some aspects of it are going to be tied to like human nature because they're there because we're there, like chickens, composting, things like that.
Sure.
But if if you take yourself out of the equation and you take those other things out of the equation, you should still have some kind of system happening without you. you know,
Yeah.
and that's what I feel like a lot of folks get confused on. They just kind of focus on the growing part, but they don't really. So, for example, like let's just take like the Phoenix trial, like all these folks in Phoenix, um, like there's one permaculture designer out there who has like hundreds of fruit trees on his property, hundreds and hundreds. He's all about the urban farming and all that stuff, but it's all it's all like full water harvesting because he pays for all that water. Um, in Phoenix, I'll just give you background. In Phoenix, they have water rights because there a lot of the houses that are not a lot of the houses were built on old orchard land, and they still have like the irrigation canals and everything that go into your house. You can go out there and open it up, and you get super cheap water rates because you have water rights. It's kind
Really?
of like the whole thing with the water rights. Like if you don't use it, you lose it kind of thing.
Sure.
So you got people in Phoenix doing all this water harvesting
Hmm.
with water that they're buying, not water that's actually falling from the clouds, right?
Yeah.
And they're growing all these fruit trees. Like there's people growing bananas and papayas, like all this crazy. Because we in Phoenix, it's a little different environment. It's more tropical. It isn't free, so we can kind of get away with that.
Sure.
But there's a whole like water question. Like we are in the desert. That's not what a regenerative system looks like in the desert. Um, so that's kind of my critique of kind of like like the process of permaculture going mainstream.
Hmm.
Like a lot of folks get it confused, and it's really, really important, like especially as a human species, to understand that we have like our role in nature is to be like the caretaker, basically, because we have the ability to like build things, make things um, out of everything around us, you know,
Absolutely.
and we're smart enough, and we already have all the technology to not send stuff to the landfill, to the stuff that we're currently sending to the landfill. We can actually make a actual, tangible, usable product, um, compost, soil.
Sure.
So we have all these, even our own turds and all that stuff. Like, there's no need for a traditional toilet. There's no need for that.
Sure.
Um, but it's so hard to have that conversation because we've been domesticated
I
and
think
socialized
that's the perfect way to put
to
it.
be that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely.
it's true because like when I was going to Mexico and there was no running water,
Hmm.
um, like it was hard to to use that system. You know what I mean? Because it was so foreign and it was so like backward.
Sure. Yeah.
So so it's hard. It's hard for people to go there, but it's necessary to go there because what we're currently doing is not the earth cannot sustain that,
Yeah.
and that's where permaculture really comes into play because it's not just a gardening method; it is a way of life, and basically, it's reconnecting yourself as a human being to nature and learning the process of our role as a species, which is like to be the caretaker. Because we're intelligent enough to create these technologies where we can get energy in clean ways. There's
Sure.
all kinds of ways you can get energy, not just solar. There's all kinds of ways because solar doesn't work everywhere, right?
Sure.
So we have like waves and turbines. You can get energy like that. We can get energy from. I mean, I've met permaculture folks that are PhDs and they know how to get energy out of algae.
Yeah.
So the technology is there. It's not that the technology is not there. It's just that um, we're just so used to the way that we're doing things, and there's a lot of money in it.
Sure. Sure.
So you're super broke, like you don't have, you're not gonna care about that.
No, exactly.
But
You try to feed yourself and your
yeah,
family, and yeah, can't keep going another day. I think you cut right to kind of the core of what permaculture, or why permaculture appealed to me, why I wanted you on to talk for people, which is kind of rebuilding that kind of connection and really identifying what our role in nature is, in terms of how we're eating, how we're supplying our food, how we're dealing with our waste
exactly.
products, and that's something that I know you and I talked a couple weeks ago, and just we kind of cut right to the core of it, which is fantastic. Thank you for doing that. Can we go back a little bit for people? One thing that you had brought up to me a couple weeks ago was that there are really three main branches to permaculture. So
Yeah,
could you kind of touch on each of those briefly?
yeah. So for folks that usually when I'm talking to folks that don't know anything about permaculture, I try to have them visualize it as a tree. So the whole concept of permaculture is like a tree, and you have the roots of the tree, which are like the fountains of knowledge, right? Like, let's say archaeology, anthropology, sociology, like all that stuff, right?
Hmm.
That's like the roots.
Hmm.
And then you have the trunk, and then you have three main branches. You have care earth, care people, and the other one is more of a concept where you pass on the surplus that you're generating in the system to take care of the people and take care of the earth. So you reinvest the surplus that the systems are generating, and then those kind of those three trunks branch out into branches and twigs, right? So, for example, water harvesting would be a branch, and then the twigs would be, well, what kind of tanks? If you're going
Okay.
with metal, where are you going to fuel it with? What's the form going to be like? What kind of plumbing? Those are the twigs, right?
Sure.
So, in a lot of like permaculture design courses, they'll hit that real hard the first day, and then throughout the course, like your students are kind of getting off in the weeds,
Hmm.
they'll tell people, you guys are in the twigs, let's get back to the branches,
Yeah.
not waste time and stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So it's a really
Perfect.
good like visual and way of thinking about it.
Yeah. That actually is perfect kind of framework for what I'd like our conversation to kind of surround. So, could we talk a little bit about that idea that you, instead of like skimming, so we live in kind of a society and a culture where anything that would be excess would be deemed basically take it home and hoard it for yourself, right? Uh,
Yeah.
which is that that's a subject that would take us probably hours to go into on here. Can you talk about how I know you work for a community garden, as well as obviously your own
Hmm.
ventures. Could you talk about a little bit what sort of the fruits of your permaculture gardens have been, and in what ways you've kind of passed those surpluses on into the community and the environment around you?
Hmm. So yeah, I'm I guess like a green professional in that respect, where I do have like a full-time job within like doing permaculture. Basically, I do permaculture every day, and I get paid for it.
Hmm.
Um, and as a I've been able to have access to major grants and major like donations. We're talking like millions of dollars.
Sure.
Um, so I've been able to, through community organizing and through like the nonprofit sector or like the nonprofit world or whatever,
Hmm.
um, I've been able to put a lot of like permaculture infrastructure into my community in Tucson. Uh, so I did a lot of work in the schools, in the public schools, and a lot of trainings. Um, I would I would go into a school that showed interest, right?
Hmm.
And my business card would garden committee made up of teachers, parents, and we can include students. But for me, the most important part was getting like adult leadership on site,
Sure.
from staff and parents, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if they could meet me halfway, then I would organize workshops with them, and I had 3 basic workshops that I would make people go through, and they had to do the whole shebang. So they had to do the garden committee, and then they had to do the 3 basic trainings, which equals 6 hours. So they basically had to invest 6 hours into themselves with in terms of like education and stuff around the work that they wanted to do. So if they would do that, then to me that meant, okay, they're serious. This might not work out, but at least they're serious, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then I would go in there and give them my time and help them build systems. But it was all around food production, gardening, because those were the parameters of the grants, right? But for me, that's fine. Like if that's where the money's at, that's where the money's at. But I'm still gonna come hard with the permaculture. So what I did is when I developed these workshops, I set them up so that the first one was all about permaculture. So the first one was I called it site design, to make it kind of like relatable.
Mm-hmm.
But site design is basically basic permaculture 101. And what we go through is how the sun works, how the water works, and then just basic design principles, basic permaculture design principles, and what permaculture is and all that stuff. And I get into some details with like specifics for our environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's like a really good like primer, right? And then I would move on into soil and compost. So how soil works, how to make soil, how to make your own worm bin, how to work with worms, the traditional like indoor method. Indoor is it's a community that Sir Albert Howard pretty much stole that information from. And Sir Albert Howard, for people that don't know, is like one of the fathers of organic gardening in the U.S. And if you have a pallet compost bin, that is like traditional indigenous technology.
Did he try to introduce it as his own?
He gets credit for it, but it's actually indigenous technology.
Yeah, that sounds like a familiar tale, man.
It's very interesting because he's the dude was from England and all stuff, and he went over there in India. But anyway, like that community was composting their human manure, and he was advocating for that, but that kind of got lost, throughout time, and
Sure.
it became like all that. But I totally forgot what I was talking about. Now I'm okay. So
No.
the soil and compost workshop. So we would go through the soil and compost workshop and how to do all that. And I would gear it towards like larger scale because these were schools.
Mm-hmm.
So I geared all the workshops so that it was the training was a little bit more than I would give like a home garden or someone that's just trying to do something in their backyard.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were going to be dealing with a lot of food waste.
Sure.
Their gardens are probably going to be way bigger. Like the amount of water they're going to have to like deal with is going to be on a larger scale. Everything's going to be on a larger scale. So it was all kind of geared towards that. And then the final workshop was all about growing organically here in the desert. So they had to do all that. Organize a committee. That committee had to go through those trainings, and then we would have a conversation about, okay, where is the garden gonna be? Because that's what everyone wants to do. Is like, this is where we want to put our garden. Like that's the conversation people want to start with.
Yeah.
So I would say no. Like you don't have time to go and look at your garden. Organize a committee. give me a call back. We have to do these 3 trainings first, and then we can talk about where the garden's gonna go.
Mm-hmm.
And I and that's the same flow that I do with like all my clients.
Yeah.
Um, Even like when I'm doing jobs for myself, for money, contract work, kind of stuff. It's always important to do the education because I can build someone an aquaponics system or whatever kind of system, but if they don't know how to maintain it, if they don't know how to work it, troubleshoot, it doesn't really matter how good it is.
Absolutely.
Um, so the training education is key to everything. So when I was in that position, I was able to train over 50 sites, and well, no, it's probably more like 100, but we like really working with sites maybe 50, and then out of that, I'd say maybe like 10 or 15 really took off. And those 10 or 15 that really took off, I was able to do like huge aquaponics systems in their schools. We're talking like 600 plus gallons of fish tank. And so those schools have really successful programs, and they're doing real neat things like those aquaponics systems fund a lot of the gardening programming. So they're working with like local chefs, and they're supplying them with like basil year round, and like key crops that chefs would like to work with year round, right?
Sure.
And they're funding like their chicken feed and field trips and things like that, gardening equipment, whatever they need. But at the same time, they're all the other stuff that the aquaponics system is funding is going into the students' families. Like the students are bringing that food home, and they're learning about healthy eating, and they're learning about permaculture, and they're learning how to be like good little human beings in the desert.
Yeah.
So it made a huge impact, you know, um, and being able to do things like that is you know, it's hard for some folks to like work like in the nonprofit sector and things like that. But I feel like, yeah, there's good and bad and all that, but if you're able to do it in a way where you don't go crazy, and you're able to actually like maneuver the infrastructure to like benefit the community, then I feel like it's worth it. So, in the past 5 years, like as a professional permaculture designer, like getting paid to do permaculture every day, I feel like Tucson has benefited so much. Like, we put in aquaponics systems in so many schools. We helped lead the charge with bringing chickens into schools so that schools could start composting meat.
Okay.
Because when we started composting, we started realizing, oh my God, like they're not feeding the kids any greens.
Really?
There's nothing to compost. Yeah, like there's nothing to compost. There's like no veggies, no greens.
Huh.
It was like a lot of, you know, the teachers would be like, yeah, we had pizza today. We had hamburgers today.
Oh, yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
so they were composting like hamburger buns, and you know,
Oh.
they were trying to see what they could do. But it's not easy when you have to like sit there and like help kids sort through their stuff. It's not easy. Like it has to be easy in order for it to be sustainable.
Sure.
So it took a lot of meetings, you know, because when you're working with like public schools and in the nonprofit sector, it's like you're working with like the biggest snails in the world. Like they move real slow.
Sure.
So people get frustrated, people get burned out because things move real slow. So it took us maybe 3 years to make it legit, where we had to work with the local health department, the school food safety and their um, their kitchen staff and all that. But we were able to come up with like guidelines where, okay, if you're a school and you meet these certain guidelines, you can do on-site composting, and you can even the food that you're producing, you can even serve it in the cafeteria. And all this is common sense, right? But there's a what it is the fear of the lawsuit.
Yeah.
So there's the fear that someone's going to get sick, and somehow that it's going to, be from the organic food at school that they're eating. Uh, and like, yeah, there's some things that you should not do when you're composting. There's some things you should not do when you're growing in general, like food safety wise.
Hmm.
Um, so basically, all we had to do was like come up with like a very pretty much hit check marks for people through trainings, right?
Sure.
So that the schools that we're working with are trained in basic food safety stuff and how to handle things and how to compost right, but checking temperatures and making sure things are getting to a certain level and stuff like that. So right now in Tucson, there's schools that are growing food, and that food is being used in the cafeteria. And it's great. It's great.
Yeah. So you basically took a system where kids are just throwing out. Basically, you're wasting whatever end product of every school lunch is, and now you're not only taking kids who are eating nothing but pizza and hamburger and introducing food that they're growing themselves without
Yeah,
wasting
food
the.
them growing themselves, and then all that other food like pizza, hot dogs,
Sure.
hamburgers. The schools that where we were able to get chicken coops in, like that food is being turned into eggs, is being turned into manure, which gets turned into soil, which
Yep.
then gets turned into food again.
Sure.
Um, so it's really teaching people the complete cycle, right? Like we have schools where, because it's all getting tied back to vegetation, right? So they're taking poundage of how much food is being diverted from the landfill, right?
Mm-hmm.
And teaching kids about this stuff, like through, math. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the other thing is that all these schools are schools in quote unquote low income neighborhoods, and you have to make education relevant. You have to make it tangible.
Sure.
So they're teaching math through this stuff. They're teaching science through this stuff, literature, language, all this stuff.
That's
So
awesome.
it had a huge impact.
Yeah.
Like a lot of, so the chicken coops, the aquaponics systems, the gardening, um, it's all being done through like the permaculture framework. So on top of that, a lot of these schools are doing the water harvesting thing. So they're growing native trees and plants that also feed you and provide habitat. Um, so it was a huge like success, right? And through that work, um, I was led through. Basically, they took me out of the game over there, and they put me in the farm game because my employer has a farm. So then I started working with the community. It was like it's a long story, but basically the farm, the farming work started as production work, and then it turned into community organizing work.
Okay.
Um, so now it's more like around community gardening, trying to build leadership, trying to get folks to eat healthy, and also the whole permaculture thing. So at the farm I work at, we have a composting toilet. We have water harvesting tanks, and our community garden it was done on contour, meaning that when it does rain, it gets watered, so we can shut the timers off and things like that.
Yeah.
So it is like the whole idea of a food forest in the desert in action.
That's very, very cool.
Um,
That's
yeah,
so
so it's
different
just like
than like the huge swaths of corn that you see like in the Midwest and stuff like that. You know what I mean?
yeah, or even in California when you're driving through the huge swaths of like orchards,
Yeah,
corn,
orchards, strawberries.
almonds, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually could you talk on that a little bit? How would you say that this method of agriculture is more effective at maintaining the environment? So a big issue. So I live in, for people who are listening, you maybe don't know, I live in California, and one of the major issues, obviously, as most of the country knows at this point, is our water usage is wildly outpacing our ability to replenish it. Is this method of farming, because it's so kind of in touch with natural course of the world, rather than kind of, like as you said before, dumping purchased water on things and things of that nature? Do you find that it is something that could be sustainable for basically infinity?
Yeah, it's a complex question because it really depends on there's so many factors. Like, so for example, if if we can get a critical mass doing the water harvesting thing, it would completely transform a whole watershed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, right now, we're in the process of healing the watershed that we're caretakers of, but that watershed is connected to other people's watersheds.
Okay.
So, if if the folks upstream and downstream of us are doing the similar strategies, um, like the impact becomes drastically bigger on the ecosystem.
Sure.
So I feel like if I there I feel that yes, but we need to get enough people doing it so that it has an actual effect. And I think that it's hard to do the permaculture farm because farming is rigged. Like um, it's so hard to make a living as a farmer because vegetables cost nothing. Um, so, but compost costs money, right? And if you're farming on a big scale, you gotta buy the compost, and
Sure.
you probably don't have time to make your own.
Sure.
So it's really hard to do the permaculture farm thing because in permaculture it takes years to establish systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So farmers don't have that. Like they need to make money now.
Sure.
Um, so it is so far. Um, it's been there's been very few like successful permaculture farms because of that. But there's very few successful farms, period, um, in the country that are like organic and they're actually in the black.
Sure. Yeah, I think you brought up a great point. Is that the competition is really driving the prices below what is reality almost too. You know what I mean? Which is a little bit interesting to look
Well,
at.
it's interesting because the food that the food that's being subsidized is cheap, but it's like a faux cheap because it's actually has a very high cost on the environment, on our water. Um, like the industries that produce these chemicals, these synthetics, they have major impacts on the environment, right? But none of that goes into the cost of the product you're buying
Sure.
because all those costs are subsidized through our tax money, basically, into our government.
Hmm.
So, and then when you have people that are trying to grow in a sustainable manner, that usually means you're growing on a small scale. Um,
What would you
so it's
consider a
really
small
hard.
scale for people, like under a certain acreage?
Yeah, so like for me, small scale would be 60 acres or less.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
And like once you get like above 100, you probably have a lot of resources behind you. But
Mm.
like 60 acres or less, you're talking like maybe 5 people with some tractors.
Sure.
Um, Once you get above 100, I mean, I have farmer friends that are growing on 800 acres, but I don't consider them small.
Sure.
I mean, they're able to sell stuff to like Walmart and things like that. So
Sure.
and
Yeah.
it's
So
still
it's a
organic and all that.
okay. So I think you brought up an interesting point though earlier when you were talking about with just the scale that you started at with the school systems. We don't necessarily need to have these large swaths of farm, do we? You can basically have several smaller units working together, as you mentioned before. Use the example for
Oh yeah.
restoring that the water quality in your
There
region.
is there are many in terms of like people feeding people in urban areas. We already have all of the technology to do that. And when I say we, I mean like we as a permaculture movement.
Sure.
Um, I love so for example, when I was doing the community organizing in the schools, um, a lot of times the area that like the admin would offer up would be like concrete areas. It'd be, yeah, like here, here's some concrete we don't use,
That's
go ahead.
almost insulting.
Because
Damn.
well, they're thinking like raised beds, right?
Yeah.
That's what it is in Arizona. Like, everyone's about the raised beds, but it's like the most inefficient way to grow here.
Okay.
So it was like, okay, I'm not gonna say no. Like, let's figure this out. So that's when I got into self-watering containers, sub-irrigated planters,
Mhm.
wicking beds, wicking gardens. They're all the same thing. It's just people call it different depending on where they're from.
Okay.
But it's basically a super water-wise way to grow. Um, instead of water draining out, it gets collected and reused again in a planter.
Oh, it sounds
So
highly efficient then. You're almost wasting no water outside of what's going into
yeah,
the plant itself, yeah?
you're basically instead of flushing nutrients away, you have a water reservoir that collects it, and you have these wicking chambers, and it wicks back into the container that has the roots of the plant you're trying to grow.
Okay.
So I started doing that, and that led me to aquaponics because once I started getting into the whole, um, because like as a permaculture designer, I inherently had like this like I'm not gonna grow in a raised bed because I know that it's wrong. So like I was very committed to that, and but at the
Could you
same
touch
time,
on that very quickly? Just why you tend to shy away from it?
okay, so for Arizona, for the desert, a raised bed is the worst way to go because when you're doing a raised bed, so the benefits of a raised bed, the traditional benefits of a raised bed is that it drains well
Hmm.
and it heats up, right?
Hmm.
So like if you're in an environment where it's really cold,
Sure.
having your garden above the ground makes a lot of sense, or where it's really wet, it makes a lot of sense because it's going to drain better, so it's going to stay drier. It's not going to be, the roots are not going to be stopping well all the time.
Sure.
And then it's going to heat up more because
Yeah.
it's exposed, right?
Okay.
So like the sun's going to heat it up more. So if you're in an environment where it's cold and wet, that makes perfect sense
Hmm.
because those functions you're getting out of that are perfect for your environment.
Hmm.
But when you take that same technology and you plop it in 100-degree heat, then it's not really working for you. It's working against you.
Okay. Cool.
And
Cool.
and I have actual like because I take data on how much water I'm using with different gardening methods through work because it's important to us at work to like educate people
Sure.
on how to grow in ways that are in tune with our environment.
Hmm.
So through that data gathering, those experiments we've done, basically the most water efficient way to grow here in the desert is if you're using clay ollas and you couple that with a self-watering container, a variegated planter, wicking garden, wicking bed, whatever you want to call it. So those two technologies together, is the most water efficient way to grow in the desert, and you can get tomatoes in 100-degree heat off of less than a half cup of water. Um, and that's real data like that we got
That's incredible.
through like real life experiences. Yeah, so um, it's like no one here is growing tomatoes in the summer off a half a cup of water.
Yeah.
And we're doing that because of the technologies that we're using, but these are all like they're not like expensive technologies, you know.
Sure.
They're totally accessible. But the raised bed thing, at least here in the desert, it just wastes too much water. And if you have to grow in a container because you know you're in a wheelchair or maybe you have a bad back or whatever it is, it's just more comfortable for you. There are ways of doing that where you're going to get the water efficiency, and you can get like food production, and they're called the self-watering containers, sub-irrigated planters, liquid gardens, kitchen bed. I don't know if that technology would be the best like across the board, but at least in areas where there is water restrictions or there are issues around water, it's perfect because it can grow a lot of food with very little water. It's not as efficient as an aquaponics system. That's probably the most efficient because the water is constantly recirculating. For example, the 600-gallon plus systems that I installed, I think they're like 3 years old now.
3 years?
Systems, yeah, they've been growing for 3 years. They're around 600 gallons. Those systems only take about a 5-gallon bucket of water every week.
That's almost nothing. In what kind of temperatures are you dealing with?
So some of them are in greenhouses, and 2 of them are in greenhouses, and the rest are indoors.
Okay.
Yeah, so the ones in the greenhouses probably use a little bit more.
Okay.
But the ones indoors are only using a 5-gallon bucket every week.
Sure.
And it's nothing for the amount of fish you're getting out of that system, and the amount of produce you're getting out of that system. And people don't realize there's like so for example, if I'm growing lettuce in the ground outside, it's gonna take me about 2 months to get my first harvest off of that lettuce. Versus an aquaponics system, where it's gonna take me a month to be harvesting from that lettuce.
So you're basically cutting it in half. That's incredible.
It's insane. It's insane. Like the production.
Now, is the nutritional value there as well?
So I'm gonna keep it real. The first year is not so much, because in the first year of an aquaponics system's life, it's still becoming inoculated with the beneficial microbes it needs to really feed the plant the full spectrum that the plants need. So you do need to supplement with like liquid seaweed and different meals that will dissolve in the water and are safe to the fish.
Okay.
So that your plants are getting the full spectrum of nutrients they need. And the other thing too is it takes a while for fish to get to a size where they're producing enough waste to feed plants. So usually that first year, I tell people to not grow any plants that fruit and bloom, because the system can't sustain that in the first year. Like, yeah, you can grow like 1 tomato or something like that, but to grow like a whole grow bed of tomatoes, there's no way. They're just gonna veg out the whole time. They're not gonna flower.
Okay.
So the first year, that's the year you want to grow like a bunch of basil, chard, kale, lettuce, anything that doesn't fruit and bloom. Go at it and go at it hard. It'll do that just fine. And you'll supplement with some seaweed, maybe some alfalfa, different dry meals you can put in the grow bed that'll dissolve in the water. Throw worms in there. And a year into it, once the fish get pretty big and you have to start culling some of the fish, then you can start throwing in your food and bloom plants because now your fish are actually producing a good amount of waste that needs to get used up. Um, and you have the bacteria that you need to process that for the plant.
So there's
So it takes about
basically,
a year for them.
yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. About a year, but once you have it going, it's pretty much eternally sustainable. Yes.
Yeah, it gets better. So it's interesting, like the tomatoes taste better every season because the system is maturing more and more because you still have the same water that you started out with.
Right.
You're adding to it, but it's like the best way I can. But if you know how to grow and you're growing using compost teas and things like that, like the analogy would be that you never stop brewing. You never stop. You have air stones in there. You have water being constantly. You have water constantly being oxygenated, and it's alive. The water is alive, and that's why that system works. Because the microorganisms in the water filter out all the fish waste, and they make it plant soluble, and then the plants are pulling all that stuff out of the water and cleaning the water for the fish. Um, so with that system, it is using 90% less water to grow the same vegetables that you would grow in the ground. But on top of that, you're getting the added function of the fish.
Yeah.
So you're gonna use 10% of the water to grow the same plant, and on top of that, you're gonna get a fish out of it. So it's super efficient. And the only drawback to aquaponics is that right now it's still very expensive to get into.
Okay.
So even if you're doing it on the cheap, and I'm talking like you can do an aquaponics system like in your house with storage totes and all that, but you're not. Let's be honest with you. So you're not going to be like harvesting those fish to eat them.
Sure.
That's gonna be like a goldfish system, something like that. And you can
Hmm.
do that. Like if you're just trying to get some veggies and all that,
Hmm.
go for it. Like that works. But the systems that I'm building, we're always building so that we can be harvesting fish out of them. So I don't build anything under 250 gallons. Um, Anything under that for me is not worth it because I mean 250 gallons, we're talking maybe 40 fish.
Sure.
But to me, like 40 fish is like the minimum
Sure.
because
Something like that
you
could
have to
easily feed a
dogfight.
family, though. Yes.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely a That is the family size system, and I don't go anything below that, right?
Sure.
Um, so that the family size system, like an IBC system, an intermediate bulk container, which is like the cage thing, has a plastic tote in there.
Hmm.
Those are used in the cooking oil industry a lot. So in the food industry,
Hmm.
a lot of restaurants, like huge restaurants, will buy olive oil and soybean oil, and they'll get shipped in these intermediate bulk containers. So then they get resold, and you can find local suppliers. They're everywhere, guys. They're everywhere. You can find them in your state. Maybe not in your little town if you're like in a little town, but definitely in the state because it's industry standard kind of thing.
Hmm.
So these intermediate bulk containers, you can usually find them in anywhere between $100 to around $200, and they come in I think it's 260 gallons and 275 gallons, something like that. Um, so what people do is they'll cut about 16 inches off of the bottom, and that becomes the grow bed, and then the top becomes the fish tank,
Okay.
and it's like the cheapest way to do it. But even then, you're gonna have to drop like around 400, $500 when you get to the pump, buying the fish, buying the media, all that stuff.
Hmm.
You need like a filter because you can't be throwing chlorine and chloramine into the water because that kills bacteria, and you're basically farming bacteria. Any kind of gardening, growing, farming, you're really a caretaker of the soil.
Sure.
And your main responsibility as a grower, farmer, gardener, whatever you call yourself,
Mm-hmm.
is to be farming that soil, be building the microbes in the soil. And it's the same thing with aquaponics. Like the any kind of growing system, the main fulcrum of that system is the microorganisms it's cultivating. So whenever even if you're doing like fruit trees or perennials, you're working with the fungus at that point. If you're doing veggie growing like plants for eating, you're working with more like bacterially dominated soils. Um, so it's really important to understand like those differences and what plants need, what they prefer, because that's going to make you a better grower, a better gardener, a better farmer. I'm going to drink some water real quick.
Sure, sure. That makes a lot of sense what you're saying. It's very interesting because it's so separate from what most people would perceive as like. I know before I got into all this, I imagine it's basically anytime you wanted to grow any sort of plant, all you do is go to Home Depot, purchase some sort of fertilizer, and then spray it on it, whatever the application is. Um, could we actually go into that a little bit for people? Why why is microbial life so important? And can you talk a little bit about why? So we kind of have this. A lot of people will have this perception that any sort of bacteria, fungus, anything like that is harmful and it must be killed. You have people spraying bleach everywhere, things like that. Can you go into a little bit of why that is really essential for gardening on the small scale, but also on the larger scale, all of our kind of forests and our environment in general?
So like for human beings, like we have certain amino acids and enzymes in our gut
Mm-hmm.
that we need to work for us so
Mm-hmm.
that we can access the nutrition in the food that we're eating, right?
Yes, definitely.
So there's that like first step, right? Like every human being has their own culture in their gut,
Mm-hmm.
and that culture is what's giving you the nutrition that you need. So if you're eating a lot of food that I call dead food, like food that's sterile, like food like substances food,
Mm-hmm.
you're killing all that bacteria. If you're on a lot of antibiotics all the time, you're killing all that bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that level of it. Like if you've killed all your bacteria, you need to be eating yogurt. You need to be eating cultured food, living food that are gonna repopulate your gut, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's step one. Because without your own microorganisms in your own body working properly,
Mm-hmm.
then you could be eating the most nutritionally dense food in the world. It's not going to matter.
Yeah, if you're not able to
So
access it.
yeah, so that's like step one. Like everyone needs to work on the bacteria that they house, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because if we want to be healthy, well, that's step number one, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of
Once you get
interesting information coming out on that now. It's really it's eye opening stuff. It's cool. Um,
yeah,
sorry, I didn't mean to
so
cut you off.
no, it's fine. So like, if you have been on a lot of medications or have been eating like a big one is like protein bars or like bars in general. What's in those bars? What are all those ingredients that you can't pronounce? You know,
Mm-hmm.
like, and how is that interacting with the bacteria in your gut?
Mm-hmm.
Or how is like fast food interacting with the bacteria in your gut?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of it has to do with our daily eating habits,
Mm-hmm.
right? So then that kind of takes us into like the whole growing thing because all of the food, whether it's a food-like substance or not, was grown somewhere at some point,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So like even the raw ingredients to make these things that we can't pronounce, they're all being synthesized from like real things, right? Real
Sure.
plants, real animals.
Mm-hmm.
So what I find interesting is that you can go out and buy a Brita meter, and you can take that Brita meter to your plants and see how nutritionally dense they are. And it's really, really interesting because, um, like, when you're a permaculture designer and you're like so like for it and all that, like people will challenge you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's like, well, let's bust out the break meter and see whose food is more nutritionally dense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whose growing method is actually producing food that's nutritionally dense.
Mm-hmm.
And no one will do that with me anymore because they know that they know that I got my growing game down,
Yeah.
and that has to do with like when we set our soil to get tested. I don't care about the NPK.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. What I care about is what are the cultures that I have in the soil, what's missing,
Mm-hmm.
right? What is not there? Because if it's not there, it's not there,
Mm-hmm.
and the micro is going to affect the macro.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have all the macronutrients in the world, but if you don't have that cobalt, if you don't have that magnesium, if you don't have those micronutrients in there, it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter. The plants are gonna ask bugs to eat them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what happens is organic growing. A lot of people get discouraged because they'll get hit by bugs, and not like a little bit, but like hard. Like they'll lose a whole crop,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they don't. And it's very challenging because maybe they've been doing the composting and doing the soap sprays and things like that. So you know what? Sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes like just composting in your yard, even if you have worms and all that, is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the nutrients are not in the cycle to begin with, they're not going to get into your garden.
Sure.
So it's really important to understand that. And even if the nutrients are there, even if they are there, once you put that into the ground or into your planter or whatever it is, or however you're growing, if the soil that you're putting it into can process it, can unlock the nutrients, it doesn't matter that the nutrients are there. So there's that aspect to it too. Like your garden, your container has to be alive. The microorganisms have to be there so that it can unlock, so they can break down the compost and unlock the nutrients in there and put it in a plant-soluble form. That's what people don't understand is that when you throw compost into your garden, when you throw compost into your container, the reason the plants react to that and, they produce beautiful plants is because the microorganisms are eating that compost and they're turning it into plant soluble forms. And same thing with aquaponics. So it's the microbes and the fungus that are really doing the work in terms of feeding the plants and making the plants grow. So synthetic fertilizers pretty much like replace that process. And that's why when you use a synthetic fertilizer, like the effects are immediate. Like, boom, you can tell right away.
Mm-hmm.
But the drawback is the plant becomes dependent on that because you're basically throwing salt into, and this is literal because if you look at all of the synthetic fertilizers, they're salt-based.
Mm-hmm.
So they have sodium in them.
Mm-hmm.
And you're basically adding salt to your garden. You're killing the microbes in your garden.
So you're basically
So
creating a system where you have to keep fertilizing with that type of fertilization. Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes dependent because you're killing the soil life, and you are becoming the microbes. Like you're replacing that function.
Mm-hmm.
So for organic growing, food production in the backyard, stuff like that, like the people that are going to be the most successful are the people that understand that they are working with the soil
Mm-hmm.
and they're trying to feed the soil because your plants are going to get sick at some point. And the way that they get sick, the symptoms that they exhibit are going to give you the information you need to know what's missing in the soil.
Okay.
So that's how I look at it. Like when I have plants with white flies, I know that piece of land is missing iron. Or maybe it has iron, but the soil activity is too low and it can't release it. Or maybe the pH is wrong, and and the plant, it's there, but the plant's can't access it because the pH is off. So that's the process I go through. I'm not even worried about spraying that plant.
Yeah.
That's like the last thing that happens. The first thing that happens is the soil gets tested for pH. You know,
Yeah.
the soil, like, we start going through the test, right? What is it? Is it the pH? Is it the soil activity? Because the white flies are there because the iron is either not there or it's there and the plant can't access it. And then that means that I haven't been doing a good job as a farmer of the soil, and I have to get back on task. So, it's that's like that is where organic gardening is gonna go, because that is what's gonna produce the most nutritionally dense food. Because once you start getting into it on that level, you start realizing, okay, like, I do need minerals in here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And minerals, there's only certain ways you can get minerals into your soil, right? So then you have to start looking into the sources that are local to you. So for me, that would be lava rock. For people in Oregon, it would be, what's the stuff they use over there?
They're using basalt, right?
Basalt, yeah, basalt. And then
Yeah.
in Washington, there's another one that I forget. All of these are basalt, and the one in Washington, they're all different types of lava. And the lava has minerals in it that are going to make your food nutritionally dense. All plants need this.
Mm-hmm.
And they're also going to help activate the enzymes in the soil. Because another thing that's super lacking in our foods is enzymes, amino acids, minerals.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of the organic farms are now throwing that stuff into their soil. So it's not there. And the enzymes and amino acids are only going to be there if the microbial life is active. That is the hardest thing to get into plants, amino acids and enzymes. And that has nothing to do with compost or worm castings or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
That has everything to do with the soil activity in that garden. If you have amino acids and enzymes in the plant, that means that plant is pretty much almost at its genetic potential.
Yeah.
And there are some farmers that are there. You know, there are some growers that understand that and they can get their plants there. But in my opinion, they're very far and few between. And, because that means you have to be, like, throwing lactobacillus into your worm bin.
Is that a type of what, for people who don't know, what is lactobacillus?
Lactobacillus is a bacteria,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of yogurt has it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure all yogurt has it. It's like the most common one. But it's a bacteria that helps us process food, and it's one of the bacteria that you need in your gut
Mm-hmm.
to get nutrition out of food, and it happens to be one of the main bacteria that is used to culture yogurt.
Okay.
So it's readily available. Like, you can go to a health food store and buy a bottle of lactobacillus
Mm-hmm.
and culture your own yogurt with it.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do is I'll make like a crazy compost tea, or I'll maybe culture some nuts and seeds with it, like over-culture it,
Mm-hmm.
go crazy, right? And really try to get that lactose to take off. And then I feed that to my worms, because the worms in their gut, they're actually secreting little microorganisms into the casting. So if you're feeding them like bacteria, it's going to supercharge the castings, and then that's going to supercharge your soil. And that means that your soil is going to be able to maybe put some enzymes in your food, maybe put some amino acids in your food. And that's why it's so important to start eating foods that are of your place, of your region. So, for example, for me, that would be mesquite trees they produce mesquite pods, and we can grind that into an edible flour. And that mesquite flour is going to be way higher in enzymes, way higher in amino acids than any wheat flour I can grow, because that plant has adapted to the soil in my area like no other, right? So it can access things that other plants are not going to be able to access at all out of the desert soils. So it's super important that folks get into foods that are native to their area, because there is native food everywhere.
Because the
There
nutritional
are,
value of them will have
oh yeah,
yeah, that's very interesting. There's not
like
enough
wild food.
yeah, there's not enough dialogue between people in like the health and nutrition field and people in agriculture and like organic farming. I don't think it's
Yeah,
it's
yeah, it's very interesting too, because like if you look at like people in our culture that we consider like super healthy, like let's take like people that work out all the time, hitting the gym, all that stuff, right? Like I think for mainstream folks, like that's what we consider healthy, right? Like, oh,
sure,
that person
sure.
takes their health serious, like they're in the gym all the time. But for me, it's like, damn, what is that person putting into their body? Are they on protein shakes? Like, what's in those protein shakes? Is it a lot of soy? Where is that soy being grown? Most soy is GMO. Are you just injecting all kinds of GMOs into, filling yourself with GMOs? I don't know. It depends on the product you're using, right?
Sure.
So, to me, like, health is a very complex issue because it's super subjective, and also a lot of it has to do with like aesthetics, but aesthetics are misleading,
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like a lot of folks that look super healthy are probably like not super healthy internally, with the bacteria in their gut looking like, and how many GMOs are they injecting on a daily basis through the protein shakes and things like that. So I feel like if you're eating healthy, like eating in a way where you're eating in a way that is appropriate to the place that you live, like your region, your ecosystem. So that may include like going out and hunting. That may include going out and fishing. That may include like going out and harvesting mushrooms or whatever is local to you, right?
Hmm.
Like it's about adapting to like our environment and becoming like caretakers in that environment. Because, for example, in my area, like if you I know farmers that have a lot of land, like acreage, and they have deer that come onto their property, and if they don't control the population of deer, that means that they're gonna have bobcats, right? And bobcats are no good when you're going, because then you have that's your livestock, you know.
Sure, sure.
Uh, so so there is that very real world balance where like when we step into a relationship with the environment, you know, uh, that also brings along all the food in that environment, and interacting with it in a way that is sustainable. Because one of the things that I've seen here is when folks go out to the desert and they start harvesting stuff, if they're sometimes when they're new at it, they do it in a way that's actually more harmful to their environment.
Than if they were
So
just to go to the grocery store and like pick something up off the
yeah,
shelf.
so
Yeah,
there's always that balance, right? Like
sure.
let's learn about the resources around us and interact with the environment. But at the end of the day, we're human beings and we're highly intelligent, and we can go out into nature, collect seeds, and bring these genetics home and start putting those genetics on our land, right?
Hmm.
So on my property, we have 27 trees.
Hmm.
Those 27 trees, only two of them are what people would consider fruit trees, right? We have a pomegranate and a fig,
Hmm.
and they're both heritage, like heirloom cultivars, whatever.
Hmm.
Those trees do not receive any fresh tap water. We have a gray water system, and we have a 1,000-gallon tank that collects rainwater.
Hmm.
So that's the only water that we use for those trees, and that's why we only have two. Because
Very, very cool.
we can have more, but we wanted to see, like, how, like, is that within our water budget? You know, like,
Sure.
would we actually have more, or are we like, dreaming big?
Yeah.
So like, yeah, we can have a couple more trees, but it took us a little while to figure that out because wanted the trees to kind of mature and make sure and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the process. Like the other trees are still edible trees, but they're native trees. We have aloe vera, we have mesquite trees, we have acacias, trees that are useful, and the aloe vera, the mesquite are edible. So we're still producing a lot of food. The only difference is that those native trees can survive off of the rainwater that I get. I don't
Mm-hmm.
have to water them at all. I just have to set them up initially so that they get that rainwater, and after that, they're good. The same thing with I'm growing nopales, a lot of native edibles in the yard, a lot of wild food in the yard. Um, we'll go out into the desert and collect seeds, collect cuttings, and bring them back home and start growing them at home. And that's probably the most sustainable way to do it is create that regenerative system in the property that you already have, the property that you're already the caretaker of, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Learn how the water works, learn how the sun works with your property, figure out where the microclimates are. Maybe you can fit like a gray water system right there and grow some stone fruit in the shade, in the winter shade,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. But yeah, it's super important to like learn what is food in your area and begin that relationship and be conscious of your actions as a human being. Like if you are going to go into the wild and harvest from the wild, make sure you're doing it in a way that's regenerative, right? Make sure you're doing it in a way where you're actually becoming responsible human beings and are like actively participating in the process of creation, right? Like in nature.
Sure.
Just like all the other plants, just like all the other animals.
Mm-hmm.
We all have our role, we all have our place. And ours is super powerful if we can realize what it is and become like active participants in that as human beings.
I think you just nailed it, man. I don't think we can end it at a better point than that. I really I find your outlook on your relationship with the environment to be really inspirational. That's one of the biggest reasons I wanted to have you on for people to listen to. Um, it's just like one final point for people. So you brought up all these examples of how you are living this day to day, which is one of the major reasons I wanted to invite you to do this. There's people who've written books on it and things like that, but until you can talk to someone who's doing it on a day to day basis, and I really appreciate how real and honest you were with some of the things, like with the aquaponics. You're saying, yeah, it's going to take a year, but after the first year, you can basically feed a small family with what you're operating in a 250-gallon tank. Things like that
Sure.
were very cool to hear. Would you say that if we were to you brought up like if you can reach a critical mass of certain groups, would you say that within our lifetime we could reach that critical mass? Do you think?
I think honestly, I think we have to. I think people really need to take responsibility. And I'll back up a little bit. Like people are busy, right?
Sure.
People have jobs. People have kids. Like um, we don't. A lot of us don't have a lot of free time when we
Mm-hmm.
are not at work.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that reality. But at the same time, um, like the aquaponics system only takes about 30 minutes of maintenance on a weekly basis. So I feel that it's about meeting people where they're at,
Mm-hmm.
um, right? And that short-term reality, like let them meet people where they're at, and that's fine. But at the same time, not everyone is in that boat, and some people can do more, right? Some people have more resources than others, and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this whole like spectrum. and people have to find where they're at on the spectrum and what they can do. Because, you know, if you do have a little bit more resources, maybe you should invest in yourself and do a permaculture training and try to get a lot of training under your belt so that you can be super successful in transitioning your life. You know, if that is the, because I meet people all the time through the permaculture training where they're coming from a totally different environment than me to the desert just to learn how we do it here. Just because they're a permaculture designer from somewhere else and they've gotten jobs in Africa and they found themselves not knowing what to do. So there's things like that, like it's just about where you're at and what you can do. But I think that you have to do something, right?
Yes,
Like,
absolutely agree.
for example, if you have grass, get rid of the grass.
Yeah.
Straight up, get rid of the grass. Like, anyone right now, if you're listening, if you have grass, vegetables and fruits take the same amount of water to grow as grass. So however much grass you have, that's a garden that you're not growing.
Yeah.
And you can't eat your grass, right? So I feel like that's an easy one. You know, that's an easy one. Like, everyone should not be growing grass, right? Like, and you don't have to grow food. You don't have to grow food, but maybe you can grow some fruit trees, you know? Maybe you can grow some, like, native, like, let's say that in your area, like, maple is a native tree. Put in a maple tree, man, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
tap that thing. So it's kind of like that, like, and maybe like you live in an area where you have native grasses, and that's a whole different conversation, right? So I'm talking like if grass is not native to your area, 100 square foot patch of grass takes 100,000 gallons of water a year, and that's about what a veggie garden takes, you know.
Yeah.
So it's huge. Oh, that was 10,000 gallons of water.
Yeah.
So it's really about like just getting started, you know, getting your feet wet and taking those first steps. And a lot of that has to do with education and training, investing in yourself, going to some workshops in your area. Permaculture is everywhere. Permaculture is everywhere. You can find permaculture classes in your area. You might have to travel outside of your city if you live in a smaller town, but at this point, in most major cities, there is permaculture certification happening and workshops happening. There's also like tons and tons and tons of gardening. But at the same time, you have to be careful with some of the gardening stuff because you have to look at how they're treating the soil. And that'll kind of like reveal everything else about that gardening method. But yeah, I think it's important, and I think what's easier is fruit trees, perennials, like culinary herbs, medicinal herbs, fruit trees. All that stuff is easier because it's one of those things where like you plant it once and it bears ever after kind of thing. So that's like a real easy way to go. Like everyone should be trying to do like a native edible tree. Like a tree that is not a fruit tree, but that is edible and is from your region, right? So we should all be getting on board with those. And then look into gray water. Look into gray water because the rule of thumb is for every person, you can grow 2 trees for every person in your household. So think about that. For like how many people are in your household? And then that equals how many trees you can grow with the laundry you're already doing. So it's like things like that, right? It's like we're already doing laundry. Might as well get the added function of a fruit-bearing tree, right?
Sure.
And because a lot of people are into the fruit trees and things like that, but they're not connecting it to the gray water. They're not connecting it to the rainwater. So that's another thing is like you could put in a tank in your house. And that's additional water you can use for your veggie garden or for more fruit trees, you know? So I feel like those are like, that's all like low-hanging fruit, right?
Sure.
Like getting into the fruit trees, the perennials, the perennial medicinals,
Hmm.
learning what's native to your area, what does well in your area, um, like water harvesting tanks. All that stuff is like real easy things that you can do to get started. Some of them cost more than others, right? Like the gray water system, a tank, is obviously you're going to have to invest in that.
Hmm.
Fruit trees are not super cheap. But usually the native stuff is cheap. Usually the herbs and things like that are cheap. So maybe that's how you start. And then you'll invest in a gray water system or a tank. But I feel like it's super important for people to at least start somewhere
Hmm.
and to meet people where they're at and then try to build off of that. And invest in yourself, like invest in your education if you are interested in these things, so that you can do it in a way that's super successful. Because what I've learned is that, like, even though I know a lot and I've amassed like all this knowledge from all these different places, I'm learning every single day.
Sure.
Like I'm still learning from systems that I put into that I installed like 5 years ago.
Hmm.
So it's always, at the end of the day, it's always about the long and thoughtful observation of nature, and that information is invaluable. Like if you're able to do that, if you're able to observe and think about it, and receive the information from your backyard, you're going to be a way better gardener, no matter what method you're using, how you're growing, because you're listening to your plants.
Mm-hmm.
You're listening to your land.
Very cool.
So, yeah, I think that is super important. Like getting to the point where you're down to invest in yourself and understanding that's going to take a little while, especially if you're trying to do the growing thing. It's going to take a little while to learn stuff. So the long and thoughtful observation of nature, and that's going to help you like really connect to how the ecosystem in your environment is working so that you can replicate it. Because that's like if you've ever had a chance to visit a permaculture site, that if it's a real permaculture site, for at least for me as a designer, that's what I look for. Is how is this designer replicating the environment that they live in? And if I'm not seeing that, then I know that it's only subsurface level. Like they can only take permaculture so far, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you have to try to find those teachers in your area, those people in your area that are doing it on a very real basis. Like they're actually going out and observing nature, taking that information and synthesizing it for other people to learn, right?
Sure.
And they're so good at it that they've developed systems that can sustain themselves if they're not there. And I'm not talking about the gardens that you can keep. I'm talking about like the earthworks that they have, like the perennials that are there.
Mm-hmm.
The perennials should always outlive the designer, in permaculture.
Sure. Can you, would you be able to recommend, so someone, perhaps not something, well, we'll talk about a little bit more about regional stuff real quick before we finish up the call, but are there any places you could recommend that people go online? Like say someone lives in, I don't know, Atlanta, Georgia, and they are interested in these things. Could you recommend some resources on maybe online where they could look into these sort of workshops, things like that?
Yeah, so fortunately, within the permaculture movement, like early on, there is like a system so that what I'm trying to say is like not anyone can call themselves a permaculture designer. Usually, if someone is teaching a permaculture course, they've earned their stripes.
Sure.
Because it's very regulated. Like only certain people can be designers or instructors in a design course, and that means that they put in so many hours through a permaculture guild. So that's how it's organized, around permaculture guilds.
Mm-hmm.
The one that I'm a part of is the Sonoran Permaculture Guild. But what I would do is I would look up like permaculture guild and then your state,
Okay. Cool.
because they might not have one in your city, but there's usually one in the major cities.
Okay.
So there's I think the Phoenix Permaculture Guild is what they call it up there.
Hmm.
But there's usually like different ones, right? And the way that the guilds work is like real recognize real, like there's no real like form, at least from my understanding here locally, there's like no real like formal way of doing it. But basically, I went and got my permaculture design course certificate. I went through the course. I got the certificate and everything, and then I went off into the world and did amazing things, right?
Hmm.
So like that work pretty much like is like my business card, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
And through that work, um, like they brought me on board to do workshops, and I'm part of the process kind of thing.
Very cool.
So usually the permaculture guilds are legit because it's actual designers that are running the show, right?
Sure.
People that came up through the permaculture movement, and they put in the time, they earned the stripes and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So usually the permaculture guilds are on point. What I would be more careful with would be like the Master Gardener program, or like organic gardening classes,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of times in these classes they're not really focused on like whole system thinking.
Mm-hmm.
They're more like we were talking at the very beginning of the conversation. They're like in the twigs, right?
Sure.
And they might not have some of these foundations in place,
Mm-hmm.
or they might not even be thinking about some of these other things. So that's why I kind of always default with the permaculture, because if you start out with permaculture and then you're trying to do the gardening thing, it's gonna work out for you like super good.
Sure. But it might not necessarily
But
go
yeah,
the opposite direction. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that's definitely a possibility with master gardeners. Is like it's hit or miss, man. It really depends on where you're at.
Yeah.
Some of them are super awesome, and like some of them are super bad. So it just depends. But for the most part, if you can locate a permaculture guild, you're gonna find people that earn their stripes, and they usually have workshops about what we call like twig conversation. So, for example, I do an aquaponic workshop, I do a chicken workshop, and like other folks in the guild do like beekeeping, fermentation, harvesting native foods, like all kinds of topics, medicinals and things like that. So everyone kind of has their specialty, right? But we all kind of come together for the certification course.
Okay.
And getting people trained up and certified and blah, blah, blah.
Very, very cool.
So usually it's going to connect you to the community in your area.
Yeah.
So that's why it's also good, because you're going to meet all these people that are doing the work, and maybe you don't have time to do something, but you can hire someone to do it for you, right?
Sure.
So there's that reality too, is that it's a good way to network and find people that can do legit work for you if you are in a position to hire people to do work for you.
Mm-hmm. Very cool.
Yeah, so the permaculture guild.
Sounds good. All right. So that is basically all the questions I have for you today, at least. Man, I might have to ask you back on at some point. I feel like we just scraped the surface.
Sure,
That'd be awesome. In the meantime, for people who are kind of interested in what you're talking about, I know you had said you teach a few classes. So if, in the case that anyone might be near you, are there any upcoming classes that you have in the Tucson area?
Yeah, so I have a aquaponics design class happening May 21st in Tucson. The info is on my Instagram page. I'm the Sonoran Desert Grower on there.
Okay.
_desert_grower.
Okay.
And whenever I have workshops, I put them up on there. and I usually do several. Like we're coming up on workshop season, which is like for me it's the summer.
Okay.
Um, so I'm in communication with different collectives and things like that. But if you are in Arizona, in southern Arizona, and you're interested, you can just check the Instagram feed and they'll go up as soon as they get scheduled.
Very cool. Sounds good.
And
And
I
then
also,
yeah,
I want to throw something else out there. I
of
just
course.
remember, so I'm looking at them. I root black mixed figs from a approximately 300-year-old cultivar in the Sonoran Desert. Um, so they do super well here. They handle the heat. They produce a lot of figs, and we're also hitting that rooting season. So every spring, I'm rooting fig cuttings, and I sell them for $30. Basically a root ball. You get like a nice little half-gallon root ball of heirloom Sonoran Desert cultivar for $30.
Very cool.
So yeah, they're not rooted yet, but they'll be rooted soon if you guys are around me or whatnot.
Okay. And then for people who are maybe not around you, what's the best place to keep up with sort of the type of stuff that you're doing in terms of is your Instagram account perhaps the best, or do you have any other accounts that you'd like people to check out?
So right now, I just have I'm really late in the game with the whole like social media thing.
No worries. You're working,
Um,
man. It sounds like you've been working hard for the better part of a
yeah, like
decade, more than marketing, man.
yeah,
That you're doing the actual
with
work.
youth and I work with youth like high school kids a lot, and they were talking a lot about this Instagram thing, and I didn't really understand it. It's just pictures and stuff,
Hmm.
but they like forced me onto it, right? Like they were like, it's like you don't understand, like people are gonna love you and all that stuff, and
Yeah,
they're so right.
yeah,
Like it's kind of crazy. Like for me, it's just like my everyday. Like I'm just doing this stuff, and I guess it's so different from what other folks are doing that it becomes like interesting or something. I don't know.
yeah.
But yeah, I'm. The other thing people are pushing for is a YouTube channel.
Hmm.
So I'm thinking about it, but I need to get like a computer and stuff like that.
I feel
So,
you.
but I think at some point there is going to be a Sonoran Desert YouTube channel.
Very cool.
At some
Very
point.
cool. All right. In the meantime, though, what was the best handle to reach you at again?
It is the underscore desert underscore desert underscore grower.
So
Oh,
the
I totally said it wrong. I
Yeah,
totally said
you
it wrong.
doubled up desert. It's the Sonoran Desert
Yeah,
Grower, right? Yeah. Okay,
the
so
Sonoran Desert grower under slashes under all that.
between every word. Okay, very cool, very cool. And you spell
Yeah,
Sonoran, it's what? Sonoran?
yeah.
Okay, very cool, very cool. All right, thank you so much, Zotero. I really appreciate your time, man. And I hope
No problem.
everyone else was able to get in some cool stuff. I appreciate what you're doing with all the work with the schools, and then just kind of sending the message to people that we don't have to sit idly by while we fuck up the planet.
Right?
Yeah,
For sure.
yeah, yeah. I really appreciate it, man. All right, brother. I will talk to you soon, and thanks for coming on.
All right, man. Take care. Have a good day.
All right, you too.